All right, I see the attendees list is slowing down as folks join. Welcome everyone to our October webinar series here at the Sustainable Forest Education Cooperative. I'm Lane Mosier, I'm the program coordinator, joined today by a handful of great panelists and Eli Sagor, the program manager at the Sustainable Forest Education Cooperative. So the format for this webinar today is going to be kind of a change. So we have about half the time devoted to a discussion between myself and Brad and Ryan and Mike. And then in the last 20 or 25 minutes, we'll open it up. Eli will now give us a little spiel on Slido and how that will work for audience engagement.
All right, hey everybody. So we've got just a great group of speakers here. And what we're going to ask you to do is to submit your questions, because as Lane, I think, said a moment ago, a chunk of this is going to be really focused on the questions you have for folks. So I'm about to put something into the chat here, which is a link to an offsite Q&A system. It should be pretty easy to use. And I think it'll be self-explanatory. Many of you have used it before, but it's called Slido. The link is right there in your chat. I will submit some additional instructions via the Zoom chat, but we're asking you to submit your questions there. You can submit them. You can also thumbs up other people's questions to help us to know which questions we want to focus on. So I'll leave it at that for now. I'm really excited to hear what we hear from our panelists. Feel free to test Slido. You can submit a question anytime, and if it's just a test, I'll get rid of it. So no worries there. But any questions, you can reach out to me on the chat, but use that link that I just shared to submit your questions.
Thanks, Eli. And as you all think of questions, even they will be here for the entire session. So don't feel like you got to save them for the open Q&A portion. Just get those out as you think of them. So now we'll go around the figurative room here and introduce our panelists and then get started. So starting with you, Brad, what's your name, where do you work, and what's your favorite thing to do in fall?
Sure. So my name is Brad Hutnick. I work as a silviculturist, forest ecologist here with the Department of Natural Resources in Wisconsin. I've been with the DNR since 2002. Prior to that, I worked for a number of different consulting companies, which I really enjoyed. And then in coming to the state, I actually worked as a field forester for a long time, and then started with the silviculture program in about 2012. So my favorite thing to do in the fall, I can maybe qualify this. I love going up north. So I live in southern Wisconsin. So going grouse and woodcock hunting, because it's one of those times you get to walk in the woods without actually measuring things or thinking about lots of things like that. But I could do without leaf raking. So if I can figure out a better way to do that, and my mulching hasn't quite done it yet, but I'm working on that problem.
Thanks, Brad. Ryan?
Hello, everybody. My name is Ryan Murphy. I'm in the Department of Forest Resources. I am currently directing the Urban and Community Forestry Group here. We do a lot of outreach education around the state of Minnesota about urban and community forests, kind of along all levels, from volunteers through practicing professional arborists. I help manage a Minnesota DNR certification program called the Minnesota Certified Tree Inspector Program, where we train and certify folks to identify diseases that are of importance, things like Dutch elm disease, oak wilt, emerald ash borer. And another project I work on is the University of Minnesota Elm Selection Program, where we're looking around the state for large old survivor elm trees that have survived the waves of Dutch elm disease through the state. And then we bring them into a screening program where we look for natural resistance to the fungus. In terms of things I like to do in the fall, I'll go with what I just did. This last weekend, I was up in Grand Marais, hiking around. A little bit of snow, a little bit of rain, but it was a good experience and seeing some of the fall colors. In terms of work things, fall planting events are actually really nice on a nice fall day. We like to plant trees in the fall, just kind of after that wave of heat and potential drought. So happy to be here. Thanks.
Hi all, I'm Mike Reinikainen. I coordinate the silviculture program for Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. I'm out of our central office in St. Paul. I've been in this position for about 5 years now. Before that, I worked in a cooperative forest management unit doing private forest management, a little bit of urban and community forestry. I also worked for Hennepin County before that, and then the Cloquet Forestry Center and the University of Minnesota before that. My position now in coordinating the silviculture program, we have a kind of a team that does that. I work statewide, really a lot of operational focus, like making sure we have policy and procedure in place that supports the work we do, working with funding, but also technical advice, and making sure people understand our policy procedure and and have current science in their hands and know how to use it. Favorite fall activities, Brad, you beat me to it. Both of those too, even the thing I'm trying to get rid of. It's definitely grouse hunting in the fall. I do love that. But I'll include fall field work too, because for some reason this time of year in the spring is when I seem to get out the most from where my office is at. But I would also like to get rid of the raking. So thanks for bringing that up.
Great. So I'll just start us off with our first question here, talking about communicating natural resources. Tell me about how you use communications in your work. What are some broad goals?
Yep. So I think, it's funny, we have our broad goals in our silviculture program in Wisconsin. We use, we try to, we're doing outreach for both the Wisconsin DNR foresters, but also consulting foresters and for foresters in general. So we'll put on trainings and we're producing documentation that, so kind of guidance for like maybe the best ways we think to manage a northern hardwood stand or things like that. And so in general, it's been to try and make these things approachable and useful to the largest number of people possible. And I think that's where we keep playing with it and toying with it to see how can we make that better? How can we expand that outreach whenever we can? And so part of that is we've actually come to we've been experimenting with this a podcast called Silvicast, which has been kind of that effort to kind of get out and try and make this discussion bigger for a lot of different people.
Yeah, and I think some of our main broad goals are, really just keeping people aware of what's going on amongst a number of different categories, including events, obviously, in-person, virtual events, as well as education opportunities, workshops. And then if there's new research that comes out, we want to be able to communicate that to folks in, real time if we can. And then just other things, job postings, job announcements. One thing that comes to mind is maintaining channels of communication. I think we're going to talk about strategies, but through, consistent communication. And so folks know that they can look here for this. So being a resource and a source for that information to get through. And then also folks know that they can send things to us and then we'll disseminate it out to the broader community.
And in Minnesota DNR, I think my position's a little bit different. Sometimes we can be really narrowly focused on who we're communicating to, and it's our foresters working on state land, working on WMA or wildlife management areas, working on school trust lands, and making sure. I think our broad goals are that they're competent in the policy and procedures that we have, and sometimes those policies are new, sometimes they're revisions. That's always happening. So making sure that we have opportunities for folks to catch up on what's changed or what's new in policy and procedure. There's also the transfer of science, though. There's always new information coming out, and I think we're kind of a conduit for trying to get that science either into policy, into guidelines that we're training folks on, or finding ways to hand that off in other training opportunities. That's like our main audience, though. I would say state, like foresters working on state land. But we also work a little bit with the public, as we rely on the public pretty heavily for supporting some of the artificial reforestation we do, like in seed collection. So to support our nursery and its function. And so we do some communication to the public, and more recently in the last few years, really getting the word out about the need for seed and cone, and trying to recruit people into that line of work. We also do a little bit of education and kind of outreach or communication with policymakers and folks that are making decisions at higher levels and want to know more or want to learn about what the issues are. We're occasionally in that seat, trying to educate on silvicultural concepts. And so I guess in all those three different buckets are very different. You kind of have to change your approach based on the person's base understanding.
Great. And so with the diversity of perspectives here, what are some strategies that y'all have found effective in communicating in your work?
So from my perspective, I think, or at least working in Wisconsin, we in our silviculture program, we work as a team. So usually we have 3 on staff. We've recently, one of our silviculturists retired, so we're down to 2. But when we're at full staff, we're kind of reaching out all the time and trying to think about, what are those ways to actually make your message more effective. And so one thing we started in 2020, it was actually the month before COVID hit, is Greg Edge and I had been talking for a while about, how do we, whenever we get together at, when we're on the road, at a hotel at night or over dinner someplace, it's like, so what are we going to do to make this different, or how are we going to improve this? And so we came across the idea of a podcast, and it was like, well, let's just do a podcast because nobody's doing anything about silviculture. Maybe people will listen to it. And so that's one thing that we found has been effective, because we can produce something that reaches a lot of people, and in fact keeps reaching people over time, as opposed to maybe I guess a webinar would do that. But this one, if people find it, then they tend to listen to it whenever they want to, like can be on the road. We actually advertise it as you can listen to this in the truck on the way to the field and then on the way back. So you've got something to, it's productive time. And I think we found it effective because it actually, if you subscribe, it actually comes to you. You don't have to go looking for it. So I think that's been kind of really fun. And, and I hate to say it, but it's our opportunity to do something that's actually fun too. So I'm a podcast junkie and I love listening to those. And there are lots of things we do because this makes sense and it's all professional. But this one's kind of that intersection of fun and educational.
So for us, I mean, I think there's some kind of what you would expect as sort of usual regular outreach tools, things like newsletters. We do a weekly newsletter in collaboration with the Minnesota Shade Tree Advisory Committee, MinStack. And that's a newsletter that goes out every Monday. Sonia Tostason here in the department is currently managing that. And, that's kind of what I mentioned previously about, there's education opportunities, job postings, upcoming events. During the pandemic era, we also were forced to need to continue providing education for things like continuing education, where people actually need those CEUs for some sort of certification. And we found that creating virtual video content was a way that we could do that. That wasn't just bullet points on a power slide, actually go out into the field with a camera, take video, record people speaking, showing things, and cutting that all together into, short educational video clips, and then deploying that in, for example, on a YouTube page. And so our YouTube page, we have everything from long presentation style format things to short 1-2 minute videos about maybe tying a knot, or here's how you can make, some pruning decisions. And another thing I think that the pandemic really showed us is that when we want to communicate around the state, one of the most effective ways, it's not so much a broadcast, but it's actually going into communities, holding events for people to come and actually interact with each other and actually just talk one-on-one, whether they're city staff or just really engaged volunteers within their community. And then, kind of spreading the word that way, I think is also really effective. One other thing that comes to mind is we offer opportunities for people to ask questions. So we have a tree info line, both a phone number and an email address. And, we've been trying to do this better over time and trying to update the process, but it's a way where the public can get sort of a non-biased, or we don't have a commercial sort of perspective on any tree care issues. So they can ask us questions, and then those lines are actually monitored by folks like volunteers or even undergrads who are in urban community forestry programs, and it's a nice opportunity for those folks to get a better grounding in what issues are out there and communicating to the public.
Just to follow up on Brad and Ryan, two awesome ideas that I think I'd like to do more of, and I think you're right, are super effective. Like having that permanence in your communication media, like the Silvicast and videos. I think that's invaluable. We're just kind of starting to move into that realm with seed and cone collection videos, and I think there's a lot of value there. Where my mind went on strategies that we found effective, my colleagues here at DNR Forestry, even before I started, had put a lot of energy into finding ways to get our folks together in one spot, to have training on a number of topics once a year. Our Forest Management Academy, we called it. It's been around for a number of years now. I think it was, just right before the pandemic, we were hitting our peak. We're getting all these foresters together. We're talking about all these different topics. We might have one banner topic like pesticide use that we're training on. And then over the last couple of years, we were kind of forced to come up with a different way of delivering that. The team that kind of works on that project, and I think some good things have come out of it. We were forced to kind of go to this hybrid model, and we're coming out, now, and we're still going to be using virtual training a lot. I think where we would have otherwise maybe had a 2-day in person. Maybe we're doing virtual training to get through some of the policy and procedure, and then we're out in the field for a day somewhere in the state, looking at on the ground examples. That's been effective. That combo, I think, using the virtual tools to your advantage, but then still having the in-person, getting together, looking at sites, even having those side conversations about some of the topics you're looking at. Another effective kind of strategy that I think that became clear in the last couple of years is I've enjoyed having many when we're delivering a message, having a lot of people delivering different parts of that message. Maybe it's their expertise, but we're spending less time with one person kind of getting a few points across. And at the same time, when those messages are delivered, this has always been the case for me, and I think other people feel this way, and we're seeing it in some of our survey results after trainings. Is people really want it. If we're having a virtual training, they really want to hear about examples from the field. Even if we're going to have a field event later on related to that training, they want to see some hard examples. They want to hear from the forester what they did, how that policy or procedure or science was applied. Those are some effective strategies I think we've been seeing.
Thanks. And so just to follow up on, in particular, what Brad and Ryan talked about, for folks that are trying to get started in creating some of this forestry content, I mean, I didn't have a video editing class in my undergrad or grad work. So any tips for folks that are just trying to get their foot in the door?
So we were here in Wisconsin. Greg and I were extremely lucky that we connected with a woman, Haley Frater, in the Wisconsin Forestry Center. So it's out of UW Stevens Point, and kind of worked with them. So she's our producer for the podcast. So we kind of come up with the guests and the scripts and the stuff like that. But she kind of makes sure that it actually sounds good, and that like we're getting it distributed and everything else. And so that's been, and both her and now Megan Espy, they've been really key to kind of making that work. And I think, like you said, in school, they said communication was important, right? Like they always said, we're going to be working with people just as much as forests, and which is really borne out to be true. But yeah, keeping up with a lot of these other tools that are out there, yeah, we never had any of that. So and I'm a podcast junkie, so it's the one thing I know. But like you mentioned videos, wouldn't that be cool if we were producing like video, like if you went to, like everything seems like it's a YouTube thing now too. Like when you have a question, you go to YouTube on how to answer it. So wouldn't it be cool if we could just produce those on the fly in addition to other things? I think there's a lot of opportunity in that.
Yeah, it worked out for me. I've been doing music production, recording, mixing, playing for a while now. So for me, the video editing was a fun extension of that. There's things that apply, chopping up clips and putting your spin on it. I would say, well, I mean, to your point about YouTube, there's ways to learn. The other thing is now we have, pretty awesome cameras on our cell phones.
Yeah.
And, with just a little bit of, consideration for, you don't want things to be too wobbly, or, shoot in landscape versus portrait. The other thing to keep in mind, I think, when it comes to production, audio it's a thing that you don't always notice the quality of it unless it's kind of lower than you're used to. So paying attention to audio and looking into, potential options for some sort of lapel mic. I know now there's even Bluetooth lapel mics that you can get in at a reasonable cost. And that alone can really bring the level up. And then especially if you're communicating education or science, you really want that message to be clear. And so I would say, yeah, your cell phone camera probably can get you a really long way. And then just that extra a little bit of investigation into that audio piece, I think you could make a great video just with that.
I'll only add that sometimes our cell phone camera videos, I think, are probably too good, Ryan. I think I've made one YouTube video for a training we did for some interns, and I was going through the editing process like, oh man, I should have shaved that day, and I should have had a lapel mic. You're totally right.
Yeah.
Especially if you're out in the field and you've got typically sometimes a windy background, that the audio can get pretty screwed up.
Yeah.
Were there any strategies as you were creating content or delivering this content that you thought were less effective than you would have hoped? And just tell me about those.
Thinking about Silvicast, we're still kind of expanding. We're still kind of trying things, and so I don't think the cake is fully cooked on that yet. Like we're still kind of changing it and kind of doing things different. But when we first started, we didn't envision I think we thought we're going to do all these in person, right? So we'll go to people, we'll talk to them, we'll see things in the woods. It'll be really interesting. And as you guys have mentioned, I think I really enjoy that. Those are the episodes that I really enjoy. But we recently had an episode where the wind, just like not knowing some of the stuff that goes with that, we found like that made it was really hard to listen to that one afterwards because the audio wasn't up to maybe what we had from some previous stuff. So we're continually learning about that. But maybe flipping that around, I think one of the things that comes with, like at least with ours, is that maybe the thing we thought not having him in person would actually be a hindrance in the big picture. But I think in the long run, it's expanded the people that we can talk to. So we've been able to talk to people all over the country and potentially all over the world and kind of pick their brain about silviculture or about issues or about maybe something they've written or they've been working on. And so initially we kind of saw that as a hindrance, but now I think it might be one of our strengths.
Yeah, and I think there's definitely there was an obvious, I think, benefit to the reach. For example, we have a monthly forum. I saw Eli posted the link to the minstack.org site, the Shade Tree Advisory Committee. So as part of that group, we put on a monthly forum when we can, and those traditionally had been in person in the cities because we're at the U of M, we're on the Twin Cities campus. There's a really strong urban community forestry group here in the cities that would come out. But then you're leaving out greater Minnesota to a great extent, because what are the chances someone's going to drive 2 hours for a 1 hour forum? So our viewership and our attendance to these forums just went way up, 3 or 4 times probably, when we started doing virtual options. So all of that said, I will say there's definitely a subset of the community that can work for, but they also don't connect with that very well. They really want hands-on. They really want to be in person, both because they learn better that way, and they also enjoy the networking and just camaraderie of getting together with folks. And we also have a large conference that we put on every year called the Minnesota Shade Tree Short Course that happens in March, mid-March each year, and we've been virtual for the last 2 years. And the feedback you get is there's definitely this sort of like, this should be in person. There's people that aren't as tech savvy, maybe I have a little bit of a blinder on. I just assume that people are like me and they enjoy, USB mics and webcams and understanding the stuff. For some people, and they just say, I'm very computer illiterate, and this format is very frustrating, and I've had a lot of issues with it. And so it sort of reinforced the fact that, yes, we want to get back out and do in person. And, in the future, maybe it becomes more of a hybrid model where you are offering opportunities for both groups and just expanding that reach.
Yeah, I had a few things. One was related to Ryan, what you touched on there. I think we started getting back into our field-based in-person trainings this last year. And even for all the benefits of us figuring out how to do virtual trainings and be able to offer a lot of content over the course of a year to folks, there's no replacing that in-person for a lot of people, not all people, but that in-person training, just based on learning styles, I think, but also related to people's wanting to network, wanting to be social. And I think that we've had a couple of really nice field trainings this last summer, and I kind of forgot that man, you pick up so much on the side. Maybe having conversations related to the topic that you're there training on. I mentioned this before. Another just thing that I think is less effective if we're not paying attention to it is not having the hard examples brought to the audience by the person themselves, the field forester that maybe had the project. I think, and like I said, I think we've seen it in some of our feedback from trainings. It's God, we could use more foresters giving us hard examples at the end after we've talked about this change to policy or procedure.
We kind of touched on this, but what are some other ways that your communication approach has changed over time?
Well, thinking, and I'll just kind of channel it maybe back into Silvicast. I know one thing that we're doing with that is kind of trying to think about the topics, big and small. So, what we've done is we've gone through and kind of taken made a big list of all of the topics that we'd like to cover during the year, or maybe the things that we think are going to be really important. But then recognize that has to be pretty flexible, because all of a sudden some issue comes up and then we're all talking about it. So then, okay, well, that'd be great. Let's do something about that. But I think it's kind of mixing it up, and you guys were talking about it. It's like both things that foresters are dealing with on a daily basis, but then maybe things that are a little bit bigger. So we could go from like an episode on ecological forestry and implications of this for our management to, why does my paint gun suck, right? So like, okay, so how are we going to fix those kind of things? And so having that broad range of things that people can you can pick and choose which ones are appropriate for you, or you can decide, oh, that makes sense or that doesn't make sense. I think that's good. But the other thing that I should mention, I think is going to be useful for ours as well, is with Silvicast now, we've been able to make it so that if you listen to the podcast, that episode, and you take a quiz on it, then you can actually you can use that for credits, for continuing education credit. So just like a quiz in the Journal of Forestry or something like that. And so that encourages people to, if you're looking for that kind of stuff, here's another way that we can kind of help you with that. So one more change.
I mean, specifically, I think thinking in terms of the YouTube output and thinking in terms of content doesn't need to be a 45-minute documentary or a 45-minute presentation. It can be 3 minutes. It could be, or 8 minutes. These things kind of between 5 and 10 minutes seems to be what it takes to get out a concept. But thinking smaller and more specific for that sort of platform, maybe more philosophically, something I've been thinking about recently is it doesn't have to be this or this. It could be more this and this. Like, it doesn't have to be in person or virtual. It could be in person and virtual. It's a similar situation. This came up at the International Society of Arboriculture conference I was recently at in Malmö, Sweden, where for urban forest, we talk about this introduced species being a good thing or a bad thing, right? It's like you should be all native, or we should just let everything out the gate. And some of the panelists discussing it, it was the same thing. It was this and this. It's not whether native is good or bad. It's yes or non-native, but non-native or native and maybe non-native in a specific situation. So I think continuing to open up and bring in more perspectives and more, just more all the time. I guess that's the way right now.
Yeah, I think that having the complementary training that Ryan mentioned there, like this, and like you can do more than one form of communication. I keep thinking of training, but that's what we do a lot of. I think having multiple ways you're getting the message out has been helpful to us. The virtual, the in-person, we have written guidelines as well, and that repetition, which I think we're getting that in the remote learning. We're getting multiple ways people are hearing information, maybe from multiple speakers. I think that's been effective, and then they're getting it in the field as well. I think one thing we'd like to do more of, and there's some of our programs in our division are doing it, is taking advantage of how easy it is to get folks together virtually now, and giving folks a platform within the organization, an office hours to come and ask questions about a specific topic. That's something we're seeing more and more of, and that our program's kind of moving towards to train on, or at least give folks, maybe you have a short agenda, like here's some things we really want to talk about, some changes in policy, some changes in some of the science we're seeing, but then there's time to talk about other questions folks have. I think we're seeing some value in that in other programs, and I think that's the direction we're moving.
Before we get to Slido, one more question that I'm curious to hear y'all's responses. What are some challenges in communicating natural resources concepts specifically?
Yeah, and maybe it depends on the concept. I think here, so good example. I think we're all, I would say, like in silviculture, I think we're kind of enamored with irregular shelterwood. But then trying to communicate what that is without seeing it on the ground, or kind of having that kind of stuff, that gets to where you like really have to be good at understanding, here's what it is, and here's how I think you can best get it. So my take on it is, we've talked about it a number of times, and I still have people that come up to me because we did an episode on it, and we still have people that come up to me and go, I still don't get it. And so I think it's just being really creative and saying, okay, well, let's try another way, or let's keep expanding on these things. And just being open to, hey, maybe we're going to have to try, 3 or 4 or 5 different ways of kind of talking about this before it actually hits, or before we actually hit on something that actually makes that really communicates it well.
Yeah, I think I'm just going to echo very similarly. You can try and do a a presentation on tree ID, whether it's in a classroom on a screen with a PowerPoint or over Zoom. But to really learn tree ID, you really got to just look at a bunch of trees, even maybe more so for pruning. Like I can tell you all these concepts for, an hour. This is a reduction cut. This is a thinning cut. This is the 3-point cut. This is the way you should make that finishing cut. This is what you should select for the leader. But it's the repetition and the seeing real world examples. And that can be challenging because depending on where you're holding a workshop, maybe you're going out to, a community college somewhere in outstate. You don't know the groundskeepers. You don't want to just go and start making cuts on their trees. So finding those examples but then also just accepting the limitations of the format that you're in. I think those are, just pretty similar to what Brad's saying. Yeah.
Mhm.
I think I've mostly talked about like our main audience. It really seems to be our foresters in our organization, not for the most part. But there's other audiences that we'd speak to, the public when it comes to seed and cone collection, at least from our program, and even policymakers. And I think some of these concepts can be difficult, like Brad was just talking about, can be difficult to talk about as professionals, and then you got to retool for an audience that has a different competency, different kind of base level understanding, and that's a challenge. I think we all know that, but that is a real challenge. And I think when it comes to silviculture, and arboriculture too, Ryan, it can be even more. It can be more complicated with some of the topics, like Brad brought up, but even ecological forestry, I find sometimes can be a difficult concept to translate from the applied science of forest ecology to silviculture. Sometimes making that link between our understanding of how systems work naturally and how we might emulate that making that leap can sometimes even be hard amongst forestry professionals. And I think that's something we're always working to do better and being better translators and more clearer translators between forest ecology and silviculture.
Thanks. So now we'll, Eli, if you wouldn't mind sharing your screen here, we can pull up Slido and we'll just do some of the questions. Reminder that there's instructions in chat if you'd like to upvote questions or what have you. This is, I like that first one. That's another question I was about to ask. What does success look like? How do you decide if your messaging was effective?
So I think that's always been a challenge, right? So we do a field day and we know we reached this many people, but do we know that they actually understood it and they're implementing it? And sometimes you don't even know who you're, like, if you actually reached it. And I think even part of that effectiveness is, like part of effectiveness might be how useful is this going to be in the future? So you do a one-off kind of thing. Like a good example, like we do an internal training, we do a field day and then everybody disappears and it's not recorded and we don't know anything about it. So it's just done. So your accomplishment is actually the event itself, not the did we get understanding or how can we measure it? So the cool part about working with Haley and Megan and looking at with the podcast is now we can look at and see how many people listened to it, how many people downloaded it, when did they download it, how long did they listen to it if they were doing something with it. So there's lots of different things that we can kind of pull out of that help you kind of answer that question, and particularly even for topics. So we might do a podcast on a topic and we get half of the downloads that we had on the other one, or something like that. It's like, oh, okay, well, maybe, and sometimes we have we have subscriptions, but then we have other people that just listen online. And if that number changes, then you go, okay, that didn't sell, right? So now maybe there's something else. So that topic isn't going to be coming back to be recycled again. So the podcast everybody leaves a trail. And so then we can actually go back and take a look at that. And we've just started to really tap into that and think about how can we use that to improve the podcast.
I'm sort of thinking along the same lines as, are people showing up? That's sort of almost like from the marketing lens. Is our communications, are our channels getting to folks? Are they engaged with the channels and they actually are aware that things are happening? Sometimes I think, oh, not very many people showed up, I guess we failed. And then we do the same exact type of outreach and it's just, it's a packed house. And so I do think there is something to the actual topic matter. Sometimes topics are just more engaging and of interest to folks. The other thing that I think of when it comes to, I think it's easier to assess when it's in real life. What's real life? In person, are people getting excited by the end of the day? Are you getting conversations happening? Are they coming up and like getting into conversations, or like it's triggering things for them? And you actually can, it's sort of an energetic thing. Like they're enthused, they're engaged, they're awake. I know that, after 2 hours of PowerPoint, the whole room is starting to sag and wilt. But I think for me, that's, if those sparks and those connections are being made from the people attending, I feel like that's a good feedback loop. And the last thing I'll say is that in some ways we're not sure yet, because when it comes to trees and tree science, it's this, we're not growing Arabidopsis here. We're growing these organisms that are going to outlive us. So how do we know if our education is being effective? Well, maybe we'll find out in 50 years, 100 years, like, oh, did our tree diversity talks, affect the forest? Did we save millions of dollars on avoiding the next invasive pest? Sometimes it's just, it's going to be time will tell.
So yeah, I like that, Brian, that we just had a training a few weeks back, and that energy, that electricity, or like, you're like, wow, people were talking the whole time and a lot of good engagement. Sometimes you walk away from that and you're like, that must have been effective, right? Like it seemed like people were engaged, a lot of communication. We also we follow up a lot, and others on our team that lead trainings, we follow up a lot with surveys. We're not trained as social surveyors, but we have those tools available to us to reach out to the audience and ask how things went, and you kind of ask those questions consistently, and you're able to see, was this effective? Do we need to make tweaks? And we take that information in and we make tweaks to how we're training. Was that way too long? Was it too short? Were there enough people speaking? Were there enough field examples? We take all that into consideration. We also have the advantage of working in an organization with a lot of data, a lot of databases where we've got silvicultural prescriptions tracked, and we can look back, and there's a little bit of waving your hand at it, but I think of like black ash as an example. We kind of look back over the last like 5 to 10 years, and I think I see changes in how our foresters are managing the black ash resource, that cover type. And you'd like to think that has to do with your changes in policy and procedure, and also the training that you're doing, where folks are thinking more about where they might have opportunities to increase diversity and keep that water table in check, based on the system they're using. But so yeah, we do have data that we can use.
People learn well from their peers. How can we highlight lessons learned from the field? Things foresters have learned that might benefit others. For example, have them as guests on Silvicast, but what else?
Yeah, so we actually try to, as a part of Silvicast, we talk with field foresters, and then we talk with researchers, and kind of try to be that maybe slippery edge between those two. So we've done, as a good example, we did a Silvicast with one of my favorite foresters, a recently retired forester named Tom Hill in Iowa County here in Wisconsin. And Tom talked about how do we manage degraded stands, because he had a whole career of looking at these things and what was effective, what was not effective. And that was a really good episode. It kind of talked about, here are things that we do on the ground that make sense. We have an upcoming, a good example too. Our next episode coming out is going to be on scarification, and how do we implement this? How do we do it? And there aren't a lot of textbooks that tell you here's how to do scarification right. And so we're going to be relying on them. Hey, what's your field experience? What is your career told you about which techniques work or don't work given your circumstance? So I think we really look for those opportunities.
I think this is still, I mean, I don't have the answer here yet, but I feel like it's the networking aspect comes to mind for me of, you know, as an educator, sometimes I put so much emphasis on worrying about, I got to fill all this time. I got to present all these topics and, just, got to hit our CEUs. But I think also allowing for time and space within workshops and trainings, and maybe it even means coming up with creative, clever ways for people to mingle and mix. You know, if, for example, if we're doing trainings and we've got people there from 7 different municipalities that are all kind of in the same area, a way for them to, meet. And then, oh, I met you at this workshop, look you up later. I've got this specific question. How are you all handling over there? So I think sometimes it's maybe just creating the space for that to happen naturally. Versus, I think sometimes there's people that have a lot of knowledge, but the last thing they want to do is get up in front of a class and give a 50-minute keynote about some technical aspect of their job. So yeah, letting people find each other and hopefully kind of that emergent property of events.
And Eli and Lane, I did not come on here to plug the Great Lakes Silviculture Library, but that seems like a good fit for an answer for that question. And I think when that came together and the way everybody was thinking about that was just for that reason, is like how can we document and have permanently like what foresters are doing and what the outcomes were, what they learned in one place. And for our organization, I mean, we lean pretty heavily on the library as a final resting place for us to have case studies and some of our more intensively monitored sites there for our foresters to see. And we're referencing those case studies within other documents. And that's a very important tool to get that information from peers out to other peers.
What makes a good forestry educator, and what is the current demand for them in the forestry field?
That's a good question. Because I think it's, as part of what I do, we're kind of educators in addition to everything else we do. So it's maybe more like being a good people person. And I can't speak, I mean, I can see like the foresters I'm seeing coming on with the state and with other organizations that I work with. It seems like I think people get that now. Like, and I mentioned it previously, when I was in school, they always said, well, you're going to be managing people just as much as you manage forests. And you kind of believe them, but maybe you're thinking, oh, they're just, saying that, but it's extremely true. So I think that's something that, like, here in the DNR, I think we actually look for in the hiring process.
Yeah, I think there's a good educator to me is I'm thinking of, for example, Gary Johnson, who's the professor emeritus here. And, people just love Gary. Again, people person, but also if you go to his talk, it's not just a dry bullet point presentation. He's bringing in life experiences. He's telling stories to illustrate a point. There's humor, there's dynamics there. Maybe you can teach that sort of thing. I think some people are just going to be naturally drawn to that sort of thing. The other aspect that I find is that it's really good to have somebody who has that real world experience. I have a little bit of that imposter syndrome when it comes to trying to teach arboriculture topics. I'm not a practicing arborist. I've never been a practicing arborist. I've, had experiences pruning trees and learning it, but I didn't grind it out for 5 years in the field, seeing hundreds and hundreds of trees on a daily basis. So when you find somebody who can both be an effective communicator, fairly entertaining, and also has seen it for real. I think that combination, fairly rare, but that's sort of I would say the kind of the golden triangle.
The only other thought on that is, I mean, you might bring some of those experiences like Ryan, you were mentioning, but you also, another skill is kind of knowing where other subject matter experts are and having that network or connection to others that might have something that maybe you need to bring in as part of a training, as part of an education event, is just knowing who's out there and what skills they have and their ability to kind of translate those skills to others.
How common do you think it is for a non-forester citizen to Google or search YouTube for silviculture content? And any speculation on what the demographic would say who search that in?
That's a really good question. I don't know. I know I do it. You know, if I'm going to be putting together a presentation, I want to know how someone else has kind of approached it, and I'll look at it and go, oh, I like that, or I don't know about that. Maybe I'd think about like taking a different take, but I don't know. That's a really good question.
I think from the urban communities forestry standpoint, it's a little bit different. I would guess, I don't have the numbers, but if I had to wager, if there's more people in the state with a small yard and a tree in their yard versus a wood lot, that's 20-30 acres. I'm guessing there's a lot more people in single family homes on less than an acre. So for us, there's a lot of folks that want to plant trees in their yard, or they have a tree that they moved into and it's been there and it's looking weird, it's looking bad. So just as one illustrative point, we had a series of videos that we put together in 2020 for a recertification, and one of the videos was on best watering practices, and just given the drought the last 2 years, there's like tens of thousands of views on that video. It's of Gary talking about, here's how you water your trees. And so for us, when we have these sort of applicable to the kind of the run-of-the-mill household owner, I think we do see that things can be engaged with.
I think their folks are probably Googling topics related to silviculture and arboriculture more than we would think. And when we develop content now, I think we might initially have our foresters as an audience in mind only, but we need to be thinking about non-foresters too, and how we might be able to make that content approachable for that non-forester citizen. And we've had an example of that recently in the last few years with our native plant community silvicultural strategy page. I think we built that to hold information for our foresters and other practicing forestry professionals in the region. But when pulling that website together, launching it, it's like, well, this is for non-foresters too, potentially. And so we need to think about how this is communicated so that they understand what is here, what this information means.
Ryan, to quickly follow up on your comment about the golden triangle, as you saw it, so that was being both an effective communicator, having field experience in forestry, and also being engaging and entertaining when you're delivering the content, correct?
Yeah, that was that's what it was. Yep, exactly.
But I think we maybe have time for one or two more questions here. How often do the presenters engage with the environmental education community? And do you see people experience these? Oh no, where'd it go? My memory isn't that good. And how often do you see people experience these sort of aha moments?
I can talk about one recently. So a lot of times we get to do presentations or outreach for other groups involved in forestry or kind of on the edge of that. And so I was with a group of people involved with land conservancies here in Wisconsin. And it was talking about forest management in the context of land protection and what does that mean? And I think one of the things I've talked about in the past is that in forestry, we very infrequently talk about restoration, right? So, or at least we perceive restoration to be like, planting trees, versus there's another part of our forest or the natural resource community in Minnesota, in the upper Midwest, that is involved in restoration, but might be thinking about grasslands or wetlands or savannas and things of that nature. And just talking about the putting forestry in that same realm of, well, you can still do restoration, but it's in this different regard. There were a lot of people that are like, oh, I get it. Or it kind of like it was very interesting, like, oh, I could see now how I might use these tools as a part of forest management if I were working toward a restoration goal. So that was kind of one of those moments I had recently.
Yeah, we do our events. We have some things that are kind of an annual thing. We've got, for example, I'm about to roll into recertification workshops for the tree inspector program. That's in the fall. We're going to do 5 of those. We do certification workshops in the spring, or we'll get back into that now after the pandemic. We've got our yearly conference that happens once a year. I mentioned those monthly forums. And then we'll go out kind of on an ad hoc basis to communities. And I think the aha moments really do, again, harping on that field, hands touching earth, touching trees experiences. For example, you talk about, we do the classroom session, and then we were recently in La Center. We go to a park and we start digging around trees. And then, oh, there's a stem girdling root 4 inches below this, the mulch. And it's like, oh, this, and it's a little tree. It's like, oh, we can save this tree now. And then, oh, here's one that didn't happen to 20 years ago, and now it's about to die. So I would say it's pretty regular when you can fuse those classroom concepts and then apply it in a field session.
The aha moments of late, I think have been kind of, so I'd done private forest management a bit before this position, and there's aha moments all the time when you're working with private landowners, and that's really fun, like very fulfilling. Of late, it's been around like people understanding the bigger picture with our need for seed and cone in the state of Minnesota, and getting the message out about, well, we need it. This is why we need it. This is how it's been, collected and brought into us for years. These are the seedlings that are grown. This is the thousands of acres that are planted annually. And when you start to talk to people, like in the media or just in the public about that, they're like, whoa, like didn't see all this infrastructure that's there, and all of this huge forestry community and the public that are kind of pitching into to plant trees, to seed sites, and how it relates to the forest products industry and then habitat creation. That's been neat to see, and that's kind of related to our need for seed and cone, and kind of getting the message out about that.
And maybe one final question here. If your education, one of your educational goals is to connect forest owners with forestry professionals, then how do you accomplish this?
That's a good question. So that's not probably our stated goal with Silvicast. But when we do, what we have done, we do see a lot of listeners who are landowners who then, when they have questions, will talk to their local foresters, or they'll reach out to us, and then we can connect them with them. So maybe it's just that like starting point for conversation.
Yeah, and I think for us, we always, the ISA certified arborist certification is the industry standard, or that's what we tell folks, is if you ever have a question, they'll contact us. Hey, can you come out and look at our tree? It's like, no, we can't, but here's what you should look for. And there's a nice website, treesaregood.org, where you can actually search by region and by like zip code, and you can actually find certified arborists in your area. And you can also check certifications, so you can see if somebody is claiming that they're a certified arborist. You can actually look on and query the ISA database. So that's one thing that comes to mind in terms of professional arboriculture.
Yeah, and that's not necessarily one of our educational goals, because the audience for us is more often state land foresters. But we do have a lot of questions that kind of come into our silviculture group through other avenues from the public, and we're fortunate to have a robust cooperative forest management program in the state of Minnesota. So we usually have a forester we can connect them with that works for DNR forestry across the state.
Great. Well, I see 10 a.m. I wish we could get to more of these questions. This has been such a great conversation. Thanks to the audience for asking questions and being engaging. And thank you to our panelists, Brad and Ryan and Mike, for taking the time to talk about communication. Thank you all for coming, and we'll see you, I think, in November. Appreciate it.